Hello, everyone. I am Steve Wernick, Reb Steve, Rabbi Wernick, one of the rabbis of Beth Tzedek congregation here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And we're coming to you with our weekly conversations over coffee. Today, my guest is Dan Pfefferman, Major Dan Pfefferman, who is a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, which is a leading think tank on issues of importance to Israel and the Jewish people. If you're not familiar with the JPPI, I really encourage you to Google it and to start following the work that they do. It really is an important think tank on contemporary issues of the Jewish people. As a fellow, he researches religious pluralism in Israel, trends in the American Jewish community, Israel diaspora relations, and more, which is how Dan and I have first gotten to know each other through my work as a member of the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency for Israel, which interacts with all those issues, and the JPPI. Dan is a founding member of the UAE Israel Business Council, which will be the topic of today's conversation, which seeks to create commercial, cultural, and personal ties between the Emirati and Israelis, and founded and heads the Gulf Israel Policy Forum. He also has, as you can tell by his backdrop, he has a regular podcast called Nuanced, a pun on nuanced, which is, of course, anybody who's studying religious pluralism has to be involved with nuance. So it's like, that in and of itself, Dan, tells us a lot about you. So please, let's welcome Dan. How are you, Dan? It's nice to see you.
So nice to see you as well. Thank you for having me on this coffee chat corner.
So I'm curious. Were you in any way, shape, or form, aware of the accords that were going to happen with the UAE and Israel? Was there any prep work that happened, or has your involvement really happened post facto?
So, in a previous life, I was an IDF strategist and intelligence officer, and I continue to lecture widely on the Middle East. And one of the kind of the basic talk I do for synagogues, federations, all kinds of delegations that come to Israel is an overview of the Middle East. And I always talk about how, probably for the last 5 years, I always mention the increasingly warming ties between Israel and the Arab Gulf and the moderate Sunni states. So I've been seeing a trend, a very clear, very positive trend, for anyone who follows these things closely. I had no idea, nobody had any idea that we were going to see full-on normalization. We thought it would happen at some time in the future. The moment I could tell when something was going to happen was when Israel, this was in April, May of 2020, Israel started flirting with the idea of an annexation of parts of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and the Emirati ambassador in Washington, Yusuf El-Otaiba, wrote an op-ed that was translated into Hebrew in Ynet, calling on Israel to refrain from this step and that it would be answered with some kind of reciprocation. Something was going to happen. I didn't quite know what it was. And then when the normalization was going to be announced, we were ecstatic over here, but we had no idea it would be this official, this far-reaching, this fast. We were just, very positively stunned by this.
So, clearly, if you read the newspapers, and as you hinted at, in some ways, this was designed to encourage Israel to not annex elements of the West Bank, to keep, a two-state solution on the table as something that'd be viable, which would change radically if Israel had made that decision.
Yeah.
And yet it seems that there, must be other things going on too, because as you said, there had been warm relationships. Yeah. As someone who's been reading this, it would seem that some of it is also is like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or, so the notion that the Gulf states are concerned about Iran's rising power in the region, and perhaps also instability in the United States in terms of its presidential leadership over the last several years. raises a question of also like, self-interest for doing that. What are some of the other factors that you think might have been behind the warming relationships?
I mean, you definitely mentioned some of them. The enemy of my enemy is one. Iran is considered a huge threat to moderate Arab countries, but especially the UAE because they're very close to it. I think at their nearest points, they're 40 kilometers apart, something like that. The UAE actually has a couple of islands that are occupied by Iran that Iran physically took over. So they're considered a threat. Radical Islam in general is something that the UAE is very concerned with, and they've been a leading force in the region in combating physically radical Islam, funding moderate actors wherever that may be. They were active in Syria against ISIS forces there. So they've really turned into a positive force. And it's not just an enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's that we increasingly realize that we have many, many common interests. But, that's just part of the story. By the way, you mentioned, the unstable American administration, but going back even before that, the previous administration in the United States, which had previously been a linchpin of the moderate Arab states and of Israel under Obama, and then possibly now even going into Biden, of course, Trump in the middle, signals a long trend line, bipartisan, of being less involved in the Middle East, especially since the United States is less interested in Middle Eastern oil. So there's also that aspect to take into play. But it goes a lot beyond that. They realize the incredible amount of innovation that's coming out of Israel. And yes, they were tapped into it already through Israeli companies working in the UAE through third-party countries for a long time. Nobody, is surprised or shocked of Israelis, guys named Yossi with an accent being in Dubai conducting business deals is nothing new. But now, first of all, they can be openly there. The Jewish community feels a lot more open to be proud and out there as who they are. But there's more. I think the UAE, as it gains more of this regional leadership role that it's trying to take on, heading the moderate camp, came to a conclusion that the traditional Arab and Muslim world approach of pressuring Israel through boycott, isolation, and lack of normalization until there's some kind of progress on the Palestinian issue just wasn't working. If anything, Israel was becoming more entrenched, moving more into the right, so to speak. And so, yes, it stopped the immediate move that could have ended totally the possibility of a two-state solution. But it's also trying an approach of let's engage Israel as friends, as allies would. Canada and the United States can have disputes, but they are normalized countries. Forget even friends. Countries that have diplomatic alliances, that have all the channels together to be able to discuss, to talk, to influence through soft power, not just through hard power. And I think it's all of these things combined that the UAE sought to accomplish. And I think with Saudi Arabia behind the scenes pushing for this also.
And it seems that like an hour, like it seems like an hour after normalization, like suddenly Israelis were flocking to the Emirates. How did you get involved with creating these business alliances? Was that something that you were asked to do? Was that something you just saw an opportunity and you jumped at it? Tell us a little bit about that process of not only how you got involved, but also what's going on the ground now in terms of building these economic, cultural, and diplomatic relationships.
Sure. So, I first of all, I mean, as I mentioned, I have a Middle East background, Middle East studies background, intelligence, all that. So, I mean, I've always been fascinated with the Middle East, but sadly, it's never been from the perspective of alliances or friendships. It's always been, to research the enemies, sadly. When talk of this came out, I was, first of all, very excited. I wanted to see if I could get involved. I don't know how. And we're talking before the actual accords were announced. We're talking in July when it was announced that they were going to be signed. It was also COVID. And, as for many people, my work situation, everything was changing. Everything was in flux. I was trying to figure things out anew. And I happened to see on Facebook, an old friend of mine, a couple of friends, but specifically one old friend, were involved in some kind of Zoom conference chat meetup with 20 or 30 or so Israelis and Emiratis. And I messaged him. I said, "What's going on?" And he says, "You know what? I'm starting this organization, and why don't you join us?" I said, "Okay, what is it?" So he said, "We don't know what we're going to call it yet. It's going to be some kind of business council, some kind of cooperation council. I don't know what." The friend of mine is Dorian Barak. He's at least in business circles in Israel and throughout the region. He's a well-known businessman, American Israeli investor, businessman, etc. And he, together with Flor Hassan Nahum, the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, were putting together this business council. At the same time, and I was one of the first people to join, so I'm one of the founding members, and glad to be involved in a fantastic group of people who are trying to use the business world, but not just, to bridge between the two countries and to try to build the normalization. Being from the think tank world that I am, and the formerly government world, I also set out to use this platform to try to network with similar kind of think tank, academics, government advisors in the UAE and Bahrain, and to form a network. And so I helped form the Gulf Israel Policy Forum. And this is a group, it's a fantastic group, it's growing all the time, of analysts, academics, advisors from both sides. It's always a 50-50. And we keep things very quiet between us. There's no official membership or anything, but it's a closed forum for really high level discussion. And it's been incredible. There's other fantastic organizations. Sharaka is one that's doing cultural cooperation between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and hopefully soon Morocco, and hoping to connect North American Jewry to the story. And I've done a lot of cooperation with them and hopefully more. And, I don't think anyone could expect not only the depth of cooperation that's happened in less than a year, but the breadth of it, the sheer scope of cooperation across so many different fields. And, I can tell you on this.
Give us some examples, Dan.
Yeah, gladly. I can tell you, on Israel's side, when this was announced, we were in tears. We were really in tears over here that this wasn't just, peace treaty. This was, it's not a surprise that it's called the Abraham Accord, very much on purpose, because it signals that we are all the descendants of Abraham. We have a common ancestor. We have a common place here in the region. And that's something that I don't know if you follow the anti-Zionist movement, the delegitimization of Israel movement. They're always trying to say we don't belong here in the region. We're not indigenous to the region. We're not the descendants of the same Jews who maybe or maybe not once lived in Judea or in the kingdoms of Israel. And here the UAE is coming out and saying we're all part of this region. We all belong here. And it was very moving. For my Emirati friends and Bahraini friends, at first when we met and we talked and we discussed, it was, one of them said to me, "You're like aliens to us. We only heard bad things about you on Al Jazeera, that you're this and that. And then, this person goes abroad and studies here, and that person goes to travel there, and they meet Jews, they meet Israelis. By the way, they don't really differentiate between Jews and Israelis.
Neither do the anti-Zionists that are trying
exactly.
to legitimize us.
And so it was so warm from the very beginning, with so much curiosity. I think just as of a couple months ago, 130,000 Israelis had traveled to the UAE, and that's with all the COVID restrictions. So now that the COVID restrictions are getting peeled back, what kind of cooperation? First of all, I think virtually every government entity signed MOUs of cooperation with their counterparts. Businesses, if they weren't already working together in literally every kind of field, what they're especially interested in is cyber technology, Israeli cyber technologies, and autonomous AI. They're really interested in AI and anything related to sustainability, green tech, water tech. They, just like us, have to, what's the word? Desalinate most of their water, even to more of an extreme than we do. And so there's so much place for cooperation. They recognize that we're truly a hub of innovation. They're really good at implementation. I am constantly stunned in the most positive of ways by how they can take complex ideas, far reaching, 10, 20, 30-year visions, or insanely complex technologies, or say, we're going to build a sustainable city, an eco city, whatever, smart city, whatever it is. And the way they implement things I've never seen anything like this in the world. I guess it's the advantage of being a benevolent autocracy. Let's call it what it is. Okay, they don't have to deal with the chaos of democracy, but it's a very benevolent autocracy. It's a very efficient autocracy, and it's based on meritocracy. And so they hire the best of the best, whether within their own society or foreign advisors, and they want the absolute best. They pay them the best salaries because they want their public sector to be run like the best corporations in the world. And that's what they do. And so, if we can come up with all these fantastic ideas here, they know how to implement them over there. And it's
maybe Israel can stand to benefit from some of their implementation strategies.
Exactly.
Or the other way too.
Yeah.
You mentioned Jewish community. That's something that is surprising to most people. Tell us about the Jewish community that has existed in the UAE.
So, in general, the UAE has really taken off economically only in the last 20 years. Before that, it was a lot sleepier, a lot slower to get started. Since then, of course, Jewish business people, all expats, have moved there for various reasons, set up their homes. The UAE is incredibly welcoming to foreigners, and they consistently are making legal reforms and financial reforms and tax reforms to make it even more attractive for foreigners to come live there. And so there is a community of about 1,000. It's hard to estimate exactly how many people. About 1,000 Jews. That may include, families where one spouse is Jewish and one's not, who live in Dubai, a much, much smaller community that lives in Abu Dhabi, the capital. And they have, like any good Jewish community, they have the official Jewish community and the Chabad community that broke off and started its own thing.
Shul that I go to and the shul I wouldn't cut.
Exactly. So they were a lot more careful with, who they open up to about their being Jewish and who not until the Accords. And now they're a lot more open about it. You will see kippahs in the malls and in public places, people in kippot and peot and all that stuff, and tzitzit hanging out. You definitely do see that. Kosher restaurants are popping up. I think there's 2 at least, if not more, and a third one's opening. Kosher caterers, Hebrew school. They're working on opening. They have a Chabad shul, and they're moving to a bigger center for the official Jewish community over there. I maybe, like in other parts of the world, you have to have an official recognized Jewish community with a chief rabbi, which they do now. So it's a fascinating community. It's a young community. It's a new community, and they're just going to be growing now that they have, they can be fully out there. Bahrain, which we don't really talk about as much, actually has an indigenous Jewish community, very small, about 30, 40 people, but used to be a little bigger. And these are the descendants of Iraqi Jewish traders, and they've been there for well over 100 years and speak Arabic and are perfectly part of the local tapestry.
What has surprised you about these interactions that you've been having?
As I mentioned, I'm a student of the modern Middle East and of the ancient Middle East. That's been something I've studied ever since my first days in college. I've always studied the region as an intelligence analyst and now as sort of a scholar. And I think we all have kind of this vision of the Middle East as a backwards place, a violent place, a place where women and minorities are second class at best. Very, very socially conservative, very narrow-minded. And I met, first of all, the place is unbelievably open, unbelievably liberal, tolerant. They say it and they truly mean it. It's kind of one of those, from my understanding, they say that their culture, because it's always been kind of a trading hub with of the region. So, India, there's a huge Indian presence, a very old Indian presence there. Arabia, East Africa, and the greater Middle East, it's always been a trade hub. And trade hubs tend to be, more tolerant, more open because of the constant flow and interactions of cultures. But about, over 10 years ago or so, they started clamping down on religious extremism in their country. They clamped down on the Muslim Brotherhood. Really clamped down and basically, told them in a nicer or less nice ways, either shape up or get out of here. And started
benevolent for some, but perhaps not for others.
Yeah, I guess so. And started purposefully introducing a complete curriculum of tolerance, openness, cultural, religious openness. I don't exactly know what the status was before, but it's now that women are completely open and free and equal in society, to the point where in executive positions and senior government positions, it's over 50% women. Education levels, universities, etc. Driving, certainly, they can dress however they want. I found
very, very different than what we hear coming out of Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. By the way, it's changing in Saudi Arabia also. Very rapidly. And when they say not to talk politics with Emiratis, because that's the one area where they don't have freedom like in Canada, in the US, or in Israel. We think of political freedom to protest in the streets, to write op-eds, etc. They don't have that. They do have their own version of political freedom. It's practiced quietly. It's practiced in personal meetings with your sheikh, with your political representative, but they have a very warm, parent-like relationship with their leadership. It's authentic. It's very authentic. I was surprised by how much it's not an act, how much they truly admire their leadership, how much they truly listen to them, respect them, and that the leadership listens to them. The second thing I found was, once you get into closer relationships with them and you do discuss things like religion and politics, I was stunned by how progressive they are. Maybe certainly relative to the Middle East, but progressive. We talked about Islam. I don't think they have a term for it yet, but if you could say, maybe like you're a conservative shul, right? In your shul, yeah. Conservative, maybe like a more traditional reform type concept of Islam, without having that official denomination, without having that official definition. But just in hearing the kind of language they're using, and hearing the kind of how they relate to the Quran, how they relate to tradition, how they view it as a part of their lives, it's certainly not orthodox. And I was really shocked here.
So would you say that there's perhaps a Islamic enlightenment that is currently taking place in the UAE?
In the UAE, certainly. From what I'm told, it's happening in Saudi Arabia, and which is a lot more significant for the region. Happening on a much greater level in Saudi Arabia. And my hope, and I think their intention, is due to their smart leadership, due to their funds, due to their execution capabilities, that they intend to use this to spread it around the region, this moderate, tolerant version of Islam, this sort of enlightenment, their openness to science, their openness to critical historical thinking is they realize, by the way, you see it everywhere you go, in exhibitions, in government buildings, you see this honoring of golden ages of Islam and of different scientific ages. You see it in what they're doing now. They just sent a mission to Mars a couple months ago. That's
Well,
not.
Mars is in need of a more moderate Islam. So
Yeah, but
I'm glad
I hear there's
that'll
there.
certainly benefit the Earth.
Yeah,
um, in the time that we have remaining, let's
yeah,
turn a little bit to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and the impact that the Abraham Accords has on that. Certainly, the PA, both Hamas, well, let me separate those. The PA, Mahmoud Abbas, and then also Hamas were not happy about this. I mean, the Palestinian issue in some way, in many ways, as you hinted at earlier, the Palestinian issue was front and center. No peace with Israel until peace with the Palestinians. And now you have basically a circumstance that's developed where the Gulf states, at least, have said, have joined Egypt and Jordan in saying, well, that's probably not the best way to deal with this. What's the impact on the Palestinian issue as a result of that?
yeah. So first, I think it's critical to separate here Hamas and the PA, and Abbas and the PLO. And you, I'm certain, understand this distinction, and I'm sure many of your congregants do as well. As we found out just a couple of weeks ago, many people in North America certainly don't seem to understand the distinction. Hamas is a radicalist Muslim Brotherhood offshoot, and they are against normalization with Israel at any costs. So their motives in doing what they did partly was to try to torpedo the Abraham Accords, and they're going to keep trying to torpedo the Abraham Accords. The PA it's not as radical, and I think, hard to say where they stand now, but they felt betrayed. The Palestinian people in general felt betrayed by these accords. They don't believe what the UAE said, that the UAE is going to try to use now its soft power and its relationship to try to push Israel to a more moderate direction, to try to solve the issue as friends and not as enemies from the outside or observers from the outside. They recognize, though, that there is a massive lack of leadership right now in the Palestinian arena, let's call it. So, when violence broke out before Hamas joined in with the rockets, when violence broke out in Jerusalem over Sheikh Jarrah, over the Ramadan prayers on the Temple Mount, the UAE was actually very upset, and that was really the first strain in these relationships. And ironically, almost Hamas coming in there with the rockets kind of allowed the UAE to focus on its joint animosity towards Hamas and take off some of the heat off of Israel. Look, I think some on the Israeli right, there were two, you can split the Israeli right into two reactions when the Abraham Accords were announced. One that said, yes, our approach worked, we need to remain strong and the Arab world will come to us. And the other one that was actually upset because they wanted to annex. And they were upset at, we didn't need to make peace with these people because we weren't at war with them. It remains to be seen what will happen. I think what this did show us is that, first of all, the accords are stable. We weathered this step with the UAE, with Bahrain. The Arab world was actually remarkably quiet throughout this entire, 11-day conflict. And I think that's, something to appreciate. And I think that's a result of the accords. The next phase is that I think Israeli leaders, I think the Israeli people need to realize that they can't just keep putting the Palestinian issue to the side because it's just going to erupt again and again. We saw it erupt in Jerusalem, we saw it erupt in Gaza, and we saw it erupt inside of Israel, which shocked everybody. And so those Israelis who thought that you could keep brushing that issue to the side and make peace with the moderate Arab world, I don't know how much they realize they're wrong, but it's clear to the rest of us that they were wrong. And now the question is, where do we go from here? I think the UAE plans on, and I hope this is what's going to be happening, this is the kind of hints I'm hearing, to take a more active, positive engagement in this conflict by helping develop effective Palestinian leadership, which does not exist currently. Hamas is radical, and Mahmoud Abbas, is ineffective and irrelevant and corrupt. I don't know if he's corrupt, but everyone around him is. And so now, how are they going to get involved? How are they going to be the country with the very deep pockets and frankly, probably the biggest leader of the moderate camp in the Arab world today, together with Saudi Arabia, to say, how are we going to moderate the Israelis and bring the Israeli right into this to show them that the benefits outweigh the costs? How are we going to develop some kind of unified, effective Palestinian leadership? And what can they do as the bridge? And that's, kind of like a triangle that
it's a tall order.
Yeah, I sense they're going to try though, and I hope they're going to try.
I hope they're going to try. I even more so. I hope they succeed. But it seems a tall order, especially with Naftali Bennett likely to become the next prime minister for the first round of the unity government with Yair Lapid. Bennett is an avowed one-state solution proponent, as I understand in the coalition agreement, there's there's no, there's a leash on that, I think, in terms of that. But still, to have a Bennett who's even more right-wing than Netanyahu on this, it's a tall order for Israel, and it's a tall order for the Palestinians. Obviously, Dan, there's a lot more that we could talk about, but I appreciate this first opportunity. We should get together again and maybe not only continue this conversation, but also talk about your blog, Juanced. I want to encourage people to tune in and listen to your work on that. And I look forward to, God willing, seeing you at the Jewish Agency meetings in October.
Gladly.
And I understand that there's some talk even about a pre-trip of Jewish federations in North America to the UAE. I won't be
which I may or may not be involved with.
Which you may or may not be involved with, and which I am probably not going to be able to go on. But as much as I would love to go, I'll have to wait for another opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I'd say wait till November, because it's just way too hot over there now.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan.
I invite everyone to check out the podcast. We do a live video stream on Facebook on our Facebook page, Juanced, and you can find us on any podcast platform to download the audio episode a week with fantastic guests each time. And we talk about Israel and the Jewish world with nuance. And that's the deal. You're welcome to follow me on my website, danfefferman.com.
And that's very similar to what I do with Conversations Over Coffee. So